Deep in the Appalachian woods, Sarah Matthews stood alone, one hand on the curve of her swollen belly, the other gripping a rusted hammer. 6 months pregnant and newly abandoned, she had exactly $47 to her name and no place to call home. This small, forgotten patch of land, a relic from her grandmother, was all she had left in the world. No electricity, no running water, just trees, silence, and the life growing inside her. What others saw as refuse, discarded lumber, abandoned sheets of metal, forgotten windows from a demolition site, Sarah saw as a beginning. The world might have given up on her, but she refused to give up on herself or on her unborn child. But could one woman, with no experience in construction, truly build a home sturdy enough to withstand the elements of nature and the far crueler storms of life? 3 months prior, Sarah had stared at a plastic stick in her bathroom. 2 pink lines had changed everything. Her hands trembled as she showed the test to Jack that night in their small apartment. His face didn't fall with fear, but with something colder: calculation. "I can't do this now, Sarah," he'd said, his voice a monotone. "I'm finally getting somewhere with the band." She had nodded, understanding his shock. "We'll figure it out together," she promised. But Jack's absence began that very night. First emotionally, then physically. Band practice ran late. His texts grew sporadic. The 3 years they had built together seemed to evaporate with each passing day. The framed photo on their dresser, Jack and Sarah at the lake last summer, began to feel like evidence from another life entirely. Sometimes she would hold it, tracing his smile with her finger, wondering when his eyes had turned so cold. The landlord called 2 weeks after Jack missed his half of the rent. "I like you, Sarah, but business is business." At the diner where she waitressed, they noticed her growing belly before she found the courage to tell them. Her hours were cut, then cut again. "Customers don't want their food served by someone who might go into labor at any moment," the manager explained with a mask of false concern. One night, she came home to find Jack packing his guitars. "I'll send money when I can," he promised, his eyes avoiding hers. The band had gotten an offer for a tour. West Coast. "It's the break we've been waiting for." "We've been waiting for?" she corrected, her voice quiet. "I've been waiting to not feel sick every morning. I've been waiting for you to come to a single doctor's appointment." He left his key on the counter, muttering something about needing to find himself. 2 weeks later, the eviction notice arrived. Sarah packed meticulously, donating what wouldn't fit into 2 suitcases. On her last night, sitting cross-legged on the floor of the empty apartment, she sifted through a box of family papers her mother had given her years ago. There it was, folded and yellowed with age. The deed to her grandmother's land in the mountains. 5 acres of nothing, according to her mother. Too remote, too undeveloped to be worth selling. Sarah remembered visiting once as a child. The trees taller than any building she knew, the silence deeper than any she had ever experienced. She called Jack one last time. "I'm pregnant, not terminal," she said, when he finally answered. "This is your child, too." "I can't right now, Sarah. Maybe after the tour." "There will always be another tour." The silence on the line was answer enough. The real estate agent she consulted had chuckled gently. "That land might fetch 8,000 in this market. After our fees and taxes, you'd walk away with maybe not enough for a new start in the city." Sarah thanked him and left, the deed still in her hand. With what remained of her money, She bought a bus ticket to Pinehurst, the closest town to her grandmother's property. As the city shrank behind her, Sarah pressed her forehead against the cool glass, one hand resting on her belly. "It's just us now," she whispered to her unborn child. "But we have land. We have a start." The pregnancy book in her bag detailed the development of a 14-week-old fetus. "Your baby is now the size of a lemon." Sarah wondered how something so small could cause such monumental shifts in her world. How it could make a man run, and a woman find a strength she never knew she possessed. In her purse were $47, the deed, and a faded photograph of her grandmother standing proudly before a small cabin, now long gone. The image of that straight-backed woman had become a talisman. If her grandmother could build a life in these woods as a widow in the 1950s, then maybe, just maybe, Sarah could do it as a single mother-to-be in the present day. The positive pregnancy test was still wrapped in tissue in her toiletry bag. She couldn't bring herself to throw it away. That small plastic omen had simultaneously ended one life and begun another. She would keep it, a reminder that endings and beginnings often wore the same disguise. The bus hissed to a stop before a faded sign that read, "Pinehurst, Pop, 1842. Sarah heaved her bags down and gave a grateful nod to the driver, whose eyes lingered on her belly with concern. The station was little more than a weathered bench outside the town's only gas station. "You got someone meeting you, honey?" he asked, hesitating before closing the door. "Yes," Sarah lied, mustering a confident smile. "They're on their way." She waited until the bus had disappeared around the bend, before shouldering her backpack and picking up her suitcase. According to her map, the property was 4 miles north. With every step, the weight of her decisions pressed down on her along with the weight of her bomb. The paved road gave way to gravel, then to dirt. The May sun filtered through the dense canopy, warming her face despite her fatigue. Twice she stopped to rest, drinking carefully from her water bottle, rationing what was left. When she finally saw the rusted mailbox with the name Matthews, nearly invisible under decades of weather, tears sprang to her eyes. The narrow dirt track had all but vanished into the undergrowth, nature reclaiming what humanity had abandoned. Sarah pulled the deed from her pocket, confirming the boundaries. 5 acres of wild, and somewhere within it, the foundation of her grandmother's long-gone cabin. She pushed through the overgrown brush, thorns catching at her clothes, as if the land itself were testing her resolve. Then, a clearing opened up, and Sarah dropped her bags. Here, the trees parted to reveal a patch of sky, a natural amphitheater in the woods. The ghost of a stone foundation peeked through the high grass. Her grandmother's home, now just a memory in the earth. With her remaining energy, Sarah pitched her small tent, a clearance rack item she'd bought with her last paycheck. Inside, she rolled out her sleeping bag and collapsed, a protective hand over her growing belly. "We're home," she whispered, the words sounding both ridiculous and profound in the forest quiet. She woke to birdsong and morning sickness, crawling out of the tent to be sick in the bushes. Afterward, she sat back on her heels, wiping her mouth and surveying her surroundings in the clear morning light. The property had a gentle slope, offering natural drainage. Mature oaks and maples formed a high canopy, while wild berry bushes hinted at fertile soil. Most promising of all was the sound of running water. Following it, Sarah discovered a small spring bubbling up from the rocks at the edge of the property. Clean, cold water that would sustain life. Dipping her fingers in, she laughed for the first time in weeks. Water, she told her unborn child. We have water. The practical challenges were daunting. No power, no plumbing, no walls or roof. But the elemental pieces were here. Earth, water, wood. People had built with less for millennia. She spent that first day exploring, marking the corners of her property with bright strips of fabric torn from her old waitress uniform. The physical activity settled her churning stomach better than the crackers she'd been living on. Late in the afternoon, the feeling of being watched prickled the back of her neck. Turning, she saw an old man at the property line, leaning on a walking stick. His time-weathered face registered surprise at being noticed. "Hello," Sarah called, walking toward him with deliberate confidence. He gave a short nod but didn't speak, his eyes moving from her face to her belly. "I'm Sarah Matthews. This was my grandmother's land." "Eleanor's girl." His voice was hoarse from disuse or age. "Granddaughter," she corrected gently. He nodded again. "Elijah Tanner. Your grandmother's place has been empty a long time. I know I'm going to change that." His eyes narrowed, taking in her city clothes, her solitary presence. "Winter's hard here." "I'll be ready," she said, with more conviction than she felt. He seemed to ponder her words, then turned to leave. After 3 days of camping and exploring her land, Sarah's resolve hardened into a plan. She needed knowledge, the kind that couldn't be foraged in these silent woods. Dressed in her cleanest clothes, her hair carefully braided, she began the 4-mile walk back to town. Pinerest's main street was a modest collection of buildings. A hardware store, a general store, a church, and to Sarah's relief, a small library. The brick building stood out, its entrance flanked by flower beds where spring blooms swayed in the breeze. Inside, the cool, book-scented air was a welcome embrace. A woman with a shock of gray hair looked up from her desk, her reading glasses perched on her nose. "Well now, you're a new face," she said, her gaze taking in Sarah's city clothes and pregnant belly with a practiced eye. "I just moved to the area. I'm Sarah Matthews, Eleanor Matthews's granddaughter." Recognition sparked in the librarian's eyes. "Eleanor's granddaughter. I'll be. I'm Marge Donovan. Your grandmother and I were in the same garden club for years." Her expression softened. "We all wondered what would become of that property." Sarah smiled. "Well, I'm living on it now. I'd actually like to get a library card. I have some research to do." Marge's eyebrows rose slightly, but she produced a form. "Address?" Sarah hesitated, then wrote down the location of her grandmother's property. If Marge noticed the lack of a house number, she didn't comment. Card in hand, Sarah began to gather books. Basic carpentry, wilderness survival, the self-sufficient life, pregnancy and childbirth. She added edible plants of the Appalachians and building an off-grid home to her growing stack. "Quite a reading list," Marge commented as she checked out the books. "I have a lot to learn," Sarah admitted. "Your grandmother was a resourceful woman. Built that cabin mostly by herself after your grandfather passed, you know." Sarah hadn't known. The revelation sent a small thrill through her. Building was in her blood. "Computers are over there if you need them," Marge added, gesturing to a trio of ancient desktops. "Internet's slow as molasses, but it works most days." Sarah spent hours on those computers, researching off-grid living, simple building techniques, and reclaimed construction materials. She printed articles on pallet construction, pier foundations, and rainwater catchment systems, carefully counting out the change for each precious page. By closing time, Sarah had filled a notebook with sketches and plans. A small cabin, just 12 by 16 feet, large enough for her needs, small enough to be achievable. She would need lumber, windows, a door, roofing. The cost at retail would be impossible, but salvaged materials might just make it feasible. "Closing up, dear," Marge said gently. Sarah gathered her books and notes. "Is there anywhere in town that might have scrap or discarded building materials?" Marge considered this. "There's a construction site on the edge of town building a new bank, and the town dump might have usable items. Folks around here throw out perfectly good things sometimes." Sarah thanked her and headed for the door, the weight of the books in her pack balanced by the lightness of having a plan. "Sarah," Marge called after her, "if you're walking back to Eleanor's land, you'd best start now to make it before dark." The concern in the older woman's voice warmed something in Sarah that had been cold since Jack left. That night, by the light of a battery-powered lamp, Sarah spread her resources on the floor of her tent. The library card lay on top of her books, a small rectangle of plastic that represented access to knowledge, to a future. She ran her finger over her name, printed on its surface. In the days that followed, Sarah settled into a rhythm. Mornings were for improving her camp, building a better fire pit, organizing her supplies, and exploring the lay of her land. Every other afternoon, she made the 6-kilometer trek into town, where she would do research at the library and carefully scout for useful materials. She sketched detailed drawings, calculating the bare minimum of what she would need. The foundation would be simple concrete blocks, a pier foundation rather than a full pour. It was cheaper, easier, and something one person could manage. The frame would be standard 2x4 construction, if she could find enough lumber. Pallets could be broken down for wall sheathing. At night, by lamplight, she read about pregnancy, marking her place along the timeline of development. "Your baby is now the size of an avocado," the book read. She would try to picture this tiny life growing inside her, utterly dependent on her success. In town, she began to notice things she hadn't seen before. A pile of discarded lumber behind the hardware store. Windows pulled from a renovation, leaning against a dumpster. Wooden pallets stacked behind the grocery. The town revealed itself as a resource for eyes trained to see potential where others saw only trash. "Your grandmother had that same look," Marge remarked one day at the library, "as if she were seeing things the rest of us couldn't." Sarah smiled, accepting the connection to a woman she barely remembered, but whose resolve now ran through her veins. She closed the carpentry book she was studying and picked up her pencil, refining her cabin plans for the 10th time. Sarah spotted the garage sale sign on her way back from the library. The faded letters drew her in like a beacon. With only $30 left after buying essential supplies, every purchase required careful consideration. She scoured the tables of cast-off items until she found it. A child's red wagon with rubber tires, a little rusty but sturdy. The older woman running the sale wanted $15. Sarah offered $8, explaining she needed it for hauling materials. They settled on $10. "Building something?" the woman asked, as Sarah counted out the bills. "A house," Sarah replied simply, surprised by the admission herself. The woman's eyes drifted to Sarah's belly. "All by yourself?" "Yes." A moment of silence passed between them. Then the woman disappeared into her garage, returning with a hammer and a coffee can of assorted nails. "These were my husband's. You take them, no charge." Sarah's first pickup truck, a child's wagon, became her constant companion. The irony wasn't lost on her. Soon, she'd have a child who might ride in it. But for now, it served a more fundamental need. The construction site on the edge of town became her first target. Mustering her courage, she approached a man who looked like the supervisor. "Excuse me," she called out. "Do you throw away any usable lumber?" The foreman looked her up and down, taking in her pregnant form and the red wagon behind her. "This isn't a charity, ma'am." "I'm not asking for charity. I'm just asking about the materials you throw out anyway." He shook his head dismissively. "Can't help you. Liability issues." Sarah nodded politely and turned away, but she didn't leave. Instead, she sat on a bench across the street and watched. At lunchtime, she approached a worker who was eating alone. "I'm building a small cabin," she explained. "I'm looking for any materials you might be throwing away." The man, Miguel, according to his vest, regarded her with warm brown eyes. The boss man said no. He's worried about liability. Miguel took another bite of his sandwich, considering her. "We throw out a lot of stuff that could be used. End pieces, slightly damaged wood. Come by after 6. I can't give you company property, but I might accidentally leave some scraps near the dumpster." That evening, Sarah returned to find a small pile of 2x4 offcuts and a sheet of plywood with a damaged corner. She carefully loaded it all into her wagon, and the weight made the journey home take twice as long. The town landfill yielded even greater treasures. For a small fee, the attendant let her scavenge through the construction debris. She found concrete blocks for her foundation, several intact windows that had been replaced during renovations, and assorted hardware: hinges, screws, even a working doorknob. Behind the grocery store, the manager agreed to set pallets aside for her instead of having them hauled away. "You're really building something all by yourself?" he asked, skeptical. "One piece at a time," Sarah replied, prying apart a pallet with a crowbar to fit it in the wagon. Her campsite began to transform into a workyard. She sorted the materials meticulously: lumber in one pile, sheathing in another, windows carefully wrapped in old blankets to prevent breakage. She labeled everything with a system only she understood, mapping each piece to the home she was planning in her mind. The physical toll was significant. Her back ached constantly, and her feet swelled after long days of walking. But the growing collection of materials represented something profound: progress, possibility, proof that her vision was not mere fantasy. One evening, as she returned with a load of salvaged 2x4s, she found Elijah Tanner standing at the edge of her camp. He said nothing, just watched as she unloaded the wagon. Finally, he nodded toward the organized stacks. "You'll need a tarp for that," he commented, glancing at the sky. "Rain's coming tomorrow." Before she could answer, he turned and walked away. The next morning, she found a folded blue tarp at the edge of her property, weighted down with a rock. No note, no explanation, just a silent aid that acknowledged her work without compromising her independence. The tarp became essential as her collection grew. She built simple racks from branches to keep materials off the damp ground, covering them carefully each night. Gradually, Sarah developed an eye for the overlooked. She could spot useful materials where others saw only junk: a discarded gutter that could become a rainwater collection system, an old wooden ladder that could provide wood for trim work, a thrown-out roll of house wrap that would help insulate her walls. Every trip to town became a scavenging expedition. The red wagon, initially an object of curiosity or pity to the townspeople, began to represent something else: determination, resourcefulness, a stubborn refusal to be defeated. "Never seen anyone get so much use out of one of those," the hardware store owner remarked one day as she passed with the wagon loaded high with salvaged rigid foam insulation. Sarah patted the wagon's handle fondly. "It's not what most people see when they look at it," she replied, "but it's exactly what I needed." Like the discarded materials she collected, the wagon had been given a second life, a new purpose. Sarah couldn't help but feel a kinship with it. Underestimated, overlooked, but surprisingly capable. When she had the opportunity, Sarah woke before dawn to a wave of morning sickness that forced her from the relative warmth of her sleeping bag. After being sick at her designated spot away from camp, she pressed a cool cloth to her forehead and waited for the nausea to pass. The baby, now 18 weeks according to her dog-eared pregnancy book, seemed determined to remind her daily of its presence. Today would be different. After weeks of planning and gathering materials, she would begin the build itself. The foundation needed to be in place before her pregnancy advanced further, making the physical labor more difficult. She ate a light breakfast of crackers and peanut butter, washed down with water, then inspected the building site. She had chosen a slight rise where her grandmother's cabin once stood, which offered natural drainage and morning sun. The area had been cleared, with rocks and roots meticulously removed over several days. From her makeshift toolbox, a plastic tote, Sarah pulled out string, wooden stakes, and her most prized acquisition, a bubble level found in a dumpster. The bubble still true despite its cracked casing. Square and level, she repeated to herself, remembering the mantra from her research. Everything depends on a proper foundation. She marked out the corners of the planned 12 by 16-foot structure, measuring diagonally to ensure a perfect right angle. 3 times she readjusted the stakes, checking and rechecking her measurements. By mid-morning, when the sun had burned off the mist, she had a perfect rectangle marked on the ground. Next came the concrete blocks, 24 of them, laboriously hauled from town over several trips. They would serve as piers to support the floor joists at regular intervals. Each one needed to be leveled and aligned with precision. Sarah dug shallow holes for each pier location, tamping down the soil with the end of a log. She set the first concrete block, checked it with the level, and felt a surge of satisfaction as the bubble settled perfectly in the center. 1 down, 23 to go. By noon, her back was aching and her hands were blistered, but 6 piers stood in a perfect line. She rested in the shade, drinking water and contemplating her progress. A movement at the edge of the clearing caught her eye. Elijah was there, watching her work with an unreadable expression. "They'll heave in the frost if you don't go below the frost line," he finally commented. Sarah sighed. She had read about frost lines but had hoped the pier foundation would be sufficient. "How deep is the frost line here?" 45 centimeters, give or take." Her heart sank. Digging 24 holes, 45 centimeters deep in this rocky soil felt impossible on her own. Elijah studied her face, then the piers she had set. "Another way is to dig 4 proper corner footings. The rest can sit shallow if you add cross-bracing." Hope flickered. 4 holes. I can dig 4 holes, she thought. He nodded, then surprised her by adding, "I've got a post hole digger you can use. Easier than a shovel." The tool appeared at the edge of her property that evening. Old, but functional, with a pencil-scrawled note attached. "Return when finished." The next morning, another bout of sickness came and went, but Sarah pushed on, determined. The post hole digger made the work possible, though still exhausting. She dug the corner holes to the required depth, partially filled them with gravel, scavenged from the roadside, and set the concrete blocks, stacked too high. The remaining blocks she placed according to her plan, arranging them in a grid that would support the floor joists. Each one was meticulously leveled, using shims made of scrap wood, checked and rechecked with her faithful bubble level. Rain interrupted her work on the third day, a sudden downpour that sent her scrambling for the shelter of her tent. She watched anxiously as water sluiced across her worksite, testing her drainage plan. To her relief, it worked as intended, with the water channeling away from the foundation piers. When the storm passed, she emerged to find Elijah again standing at the edge of her property, silently appraising her work. "Will it hold?" she asked him. He considered the grid of the foundation. "If you use proper joist hangers and brace the corners with cross ties." "I have joist hangers," she replied, gesturing to a coffee can filled with metal brackets salvaged from the construction site dumpster. Elijah gave a single, sharp nod, the closest to approval he seemed capable of. "Winter's still coming." "I'll be ready," she answered, the phrase becoming a mantra between them. That night, Sarah sat in her tent sketching the next phase, the floor frame. Her foundation was complete, a humble grid of concrete blocks that represented her first tangible progress. She laid a hand over her growing belly. "We have a foundation," she told her baby. "Now we need a floor." The bubble level lay beside her sleeping bag, its simple function of ensuring things were straight and true taking on an almost talismanic quality. In a world that had tilted sideways for hers, the level represented stability, rightness, the way things were supposed to be. She kept it close, a promise that everything else in her life might eventually find its proper balance, too. The floor joists went in more easily than Sarah had expected. Using salvaged lumber from the construction site and disassembled pallets, she built a sturdy grid atop her foundation piers. Each board was secured with joist hangers, the metal brackets keeping everything in line. Cross-bracing added rigidity, just as Elijah had suggested. The plywood for the subfloor, however, was proving to be her greatest challenge yet. New sheets were prohibitively expensive, and used ones were rarely found intact. She finally pieced together a patchwork quilt of partial plywood sheets and sturdy pallet tops, meticulously fastening each section until she had a complete floor. It wasn't beautiful, but it was solid underfoot. Stepping onto the finished subfloor for the first time, Sarah felt a surge of accomplishment. 16 weeks after her arrival, she had created the first real part of her home, a platform raised above the damp earth, level and strong. That night, she moved her tent onto it, and the small luxury of sleeping on a flat, dry surface brought tears to her eyes. Now came the walls. Her research showed that traditional stud framing was the most straightforward. Vertical 2x4s spaced 16 inches apart, with top and bottom plates to tie them together. But her collection of full-length 2x4s was limited, and her growing belly made wrangling long boards increasingly difficult. She started with the shortest wall, 12 feet long with a window in the center. Lying on the subfloor, she assembled the wall flat, nailing the pieces together as she had seen in the library books. When it was done, she looked at the frame with a mixture of pride and anxiety. It needed to be lifted and secured in place, a task that demanded a strength and leverage she wasn't sure she possessed. After an hour of failed attempts that left her sweaty and frustrated, Sarah sat down on the subfloor, her hands pressed against her lower back. Her baby, now at 22 weeks, shifted inside her as if protesting the exertion. "Having trouble?" The voice startled her. Elijah stood at the edge of the subfloor, his weathered face unreadable. Sarah pointed at the wall frame. "It's too heavy to lift alone." He nodded, sizing up the structure. Without another word, he stepped onto the subfloor, tested the wall's weight with his hands, then looked at her, waiting. "You take that end." Together, they heaved the wall frame upright. Sarah held it steady while Elijah secured it with temporary braces. The process was repeated for the second short wall, then for the longer 16-foot sections. By sunset, the basic frame was up. 4 walls defining the space that would become her home. "You'll need windows for cross-ventilation," Elijah commented, his first words in hours. "Summer gets hot." Sarah showed him the 3 windows she had salvaged, double-hung units discarded during a bank renovation. She pointed to the spaces left in the framing. He nodded in approval. "Storm's coming tomorrow. You'd best get this covered." The next morning, Sarah worked through a wave of nausea, fastening reclaimed plywood to the exterior wall studs. Each piece had to be cut to fit around the window openings, a challenging task with only a handsaw. Her progress was slow but steady. By noon, dark clouds were gathering. Sarah scrambled to cover her work with the blue tarp, securing it just as the first drops of rain fell. From her tent on the subfloor, now sheltered by partial walls and a tarp roof, she watched the storm, grateful for the crude shelter her labor had already provided. When the rain passed, she found her 3 salvaged windows standing against a tree near her build site. There was no sign of Elijah, but the message was clear. The windows she had collected were too heavy for her to move alone. Installing them required a precision she wasn't sure she possessed. Each window needed to be level and plumb in its opening, then fastened and sealed to prevent water from seeping in. After studying her carpentry books once more, she started with the smallest window. Her first attempt left gaps that would surely leak. She removed it, adjusted the opening, and tried again. The second try was better, but still imperfect. On the third attempt, using makeshift shims cut from scrap cedar shingles, she achieved a satisfactory fit. "Not perfect, but it'll do," she told her baby, patting her rounded belly. "Like us." Each subsequent window was easier as she developed her technique. When the last one was secured, she stepped back to admire the transformation. Light now streamed into her structure, the glass reflecting the surrounding trees. What had been a skeletal frame was beginning to look like a genuine dwelling. The interior walls came next, more reclaimed plywood and a few pieces of drywall she had carefully hauled in her wagon. The surfaces were not seamless. Mismatched materials created an unintentional patchwork quilt. But each secured panel enclosed the space further, creating a barrier between her and the elements. One evening, as Sarah hammered the last section of interior wall sheathing into place, she felt a different kind of stir, a distinct flutter, followed by a definitive kick from within. She froze and hammer in mid-swing as the movement repeated. "You approve?" she asked softly, pressing a palm to the spot. Another kick was her answer. She looked around at what she had accomplished. Walls enclosing a space, windows letting in light, a floor supporting her weight. It wasn't a proper home yet, but it was no longer just a dream. Through the west-facing window, now graced with salvaged trim, the sunset painted her unfinished walls in golden light. The reclaimed windows, once discarded, were now central to her home's character, transforming the simple space with their varied sizes and styles. Like her, they had been cast off and then found a new purpose. A pickup truck slowed as it passed her overgrown driveway, its occupants craning their necks to see past the trees. Sarah, balancing on a reclaimed stepladder as she attached exterior siding, froze like a deer in headlights. The truck lingered, then continued down the road. It was the third vehicle that week to show unusual interest in her property. Later, at the hardware store where she'd gone to buy her one luxury, a proper locking doorknob, the cashier's eyes widened in recognition. "You're the pregnant woman building a house out in the woods, aren't you?" Sarah nodded hesitantly, counting out the dollars from her dwindling funds. "My brother Mike hauls for the construction site," she said. "You've been salvaging their scraps?" The young woman leaned forward. "Is it true you're doing all the work yourself?" "Mostly," Sarah replied, uncomfortable with the attention. "I've had some help." The news spread through Pinarest like wildfire. The pregnant stranger, building a house from scrap, became the town's most intriguing topic of conversation. Some admired her grit, others questioned her judgment. At the library, Marg pulled her aside. "People are talking, Sarah. Some are concerned. A woman in your condition, living rough, no utilities." Marg's eyes were kind but worried. "Mrs. Peterson from the church council asked if you need help." Sarah tensed. "I'm managing fine." "I know, dear. I told her you're as capable as your grandmother was." Marge hesitated. "But winter is coming, and with the baby on the way—" "I'll be ready," Sarah said, the phrase now automatic. "The shell is almost closed in." Walking back that afternoon, Sarah felt more eyes on her than usual. Two older women on a porch whispered as she passed. A man unloading groceries stopped to stare openly at her and her wagon of salvaged materials. As she rounded the bend toward her property, she saw a sheriff's car parked in her makeshift drive. A uniformed deputy was talking to Elijah, who looked more uncomfortable with human interaction than usual. Sarah approached cautiously, her heart pounding. The deputy turned, young, maybe 30, with a carefully neutral expression. "Ma'am? Ms. Matthews? I'm Deputy Collins. Could I have a word?" "Is there a problem?" "Just a welfare check. We've had a few calls, concerns about your living situation." His eyes moved past her to the partially built cabin visible through the trees. "My situation is fine," Sarah said firmly. "You're living in a tent while pregnant and building a structure without a permit," he observed, his tone professional but not unkind. "The structure is under the square footage that requires a permit in this county. I checked the regulations at the library." The deputy raised an eyebrow, seemingly impressed by her research. "May I have a look?" Sarah led him to the build site, explaining her progress, her solar-charged battery system for minimal electricity, and her plans for rainwater collection. The deputy took notes, occasionally asking about her timeline, her plans for the winter, her due date, and her medical care. "I have appointments at the county clinic," she said. "My next one is Thursday." When they reached the nearly enclosed structure, the deputy walked slowly around it, examining her work with a professional eye. "You did all this yourself?" "He helped with the heavy lifting," Sarah acknowledged, nodding toward Elijah, who hovered at the edge of the clearing. "And I've had some anonymous help." It was true. Twice in the past week, she had found building materials at the edge of her property. A box of roofing nails, a roll of house wrap, with no indication of who had left them. The deputy finished his inspection and turned to her. "I can't say this is an ideal situation, Ms. Matthews, but I don't see any legal reason to intervene. It's clear you're resourceful." He handed her a card. "Call if you need anything. Cell signal is spotty, but you should get one on the main road." After he left, Sarah sat on a log, dizzy with relief. "Town's curious about you," Elijah commented, breaking his usual silence. "They should mind their own business. It's a small town. You're their business now." He shifted uncomfortably. The church ladies are asking if they can help. Sarah sighed. The thought of becoming a charity case made her stomach clench. I don't need help. Elijah's weathered face creased slightly. Didn't say you needed it, he said. Said they were asking. The next morning, Sarah found a brown paper sack at the edge of her property. Inside was a box of nails, the exact size she needed for the roof sheathing, and a jar of homemade preserves. No note, no clue as to the giver. She stared at the anonymous gift with conflicting emotions. Her fierce independence warred with practical need. The nails would save her precious oosh. The preserves would provide nutrition her simple diet lacked. As her baby moved within her, Sarah made a decision. She could accept help without becoming helpless. She could receive aid while retaining her autonomy. That afternoon, when she went into town for her clinic appointment, she left a small bunch of wildflowers in Elijah's mailbox. A wordless thank you, gratitude without surrendering pride. At the clinic, the nurse took her blood pressure and frowned. It's a little high. You need to reduce your stress. Sarah gave a short laugh. I'm 6 months pregnant, building a house by myself, and becoming the town curiosity. Stress is a given. A shelter before winter is essential, the nurse acknowledged. But you need support, Sarah. Let people help you sometimes. Later, as she walked past the church, Sarah noticed women organizing items for what looked like a charity drive. One of them looked up, saw her, and gave a hesitant wave. Sarah paused, then waved back. A small gesture, not acceptance, not rejection, just an acknowledgement that she existed within this community, however unconventional her place in it was. That night, using the new nails, she finished the roof sheathing that would keep the rain out of her nearly finished home. The anonymous gift had come exactly when it was needed most, as if the universe were offering silent support for her resolve. Sarah stared up at the rafters, calculating angles and weight distribution for the 100th time. The roof represented her greatest challenge yet. Unlike the walls, which could be assembled on the ground and raised, the roof required working overhead, a prospect made increasingly difficult by a growing belly that threw off her balance. Her research had shown several options. Trusses would be strongest, but required precise cutting and assembly. A simple gable roof would be easier, but needed the proper pitch for the frequent mountain rains. After much deliberation, she settled on a shed roof, a single slope from front to back, simpler to build and requiring fewer materials. Using reclaimed lumber from the construction site and broken-down pallets, she had pieced together most of the rafters. Each one was a carefully measured puzzle of shorter pieces spliced together. Not ideal, but functional, given her limited resources. Now came the daunting task of lifting and securing those rafters atop the wall plates. The first attempt left her exhausted and frustrated. The heavy beam slipped from her grasp just before she could secure it. Elijah found her sitting on the subfloor, breathing heavily, her eyes closed in concentration. "Roof time?" he asked, stating the obvious. Sarah nodded. "I'm too tired to maintain my usual independence. I can't lift them high enough and keep them straight at the same time." Without comment, Elijah examined the stack of homemade rafters. His calloused hands traced the joints, testing their stability. Finally, he nodded. "They'll do. You need a pulley system, or another pair of hands." Together, they worked out a method. Sarah would fix one end of the beam to the lower wall, while Elijah hoisted the other end up to the top plate. Between them, they set 6 rafters before sunset, creating the skeleton of a roof. "Rest now," Elijah advised, seeing the exhaustion etched on her face. Storm's coming tonight. Sarah looked up anxiously at the open rafters. I need to get this covered first. Not tonight. You're spent. He was right. At 7 months pregnant, her body demanded rest more frequently, and the baby inside her seemed to grow heavier by the day. She reluctantly agreed to resume work in the morning. That night, rain hammered against her tarp-covered frame, finding every gap and seam. Water dripped steadily into her tent, pooling on the ground sheet she'd stretched beneath her sleeping bag. By morning, she was damp and chilled, more determined than ever to get a proper roof on. To her surprise, Elijah arrived early, carrying an old blue tarp larger than any she owned. Without discussion, they lashed it across the rafters, creating a temporary shield while they worked. The next challenge was sheathing. Plywood would be ideal, but she'd only salvaged 3 partial sheets, not nearly enough. Creativity was required. The old valley barn was torn down last spring, Elijah mentioned casually. Still a pile of metal roofing stacked behind it. Owner might sell it cheap. The information was typical of Elijah, offered without pressure, an opportunity without the sting of charity. Sarah nodded, grateful. Where exactly? The farm's owner, a gruff woman in her 70s, looked skeptical when Sarah arrived with her small handcart. You're the one building out there alone? In your condition? Yes, ma'am. I heard you might have some metal roofing available. The woman studied her thoughtfully. My husband never threw a thing away. The sheets have some rust spots, but they're sound. She named a price lower than Sarah had dared to hope for. That is, if you haul it yourself. It might be more than my little cart can handle. I'll make as many trips as I need to. The woman's weathered face softened almost imperceptibly. My grandson's coming by with his truck tomorrow. Might be he could be convinced to drop it at your place. Sarah swallowed her pride. That would be a great help. 2 days later, a pickup truck rumbled onto her property, loaded with corrugated metal sheets in various states of wear. A young man in his early 20s helped her unload them, making no comment on her situation. A quiet kindness Sarah deeply appreciated. Working with the metal roofing was a challenge. The sheets were heavy, the edges sharp, and a precise overlap was essential to prevent leaks. Sarah built makeshift scaffolding from salvaged lumber, creating platforms that allowed her to work more safely. Elijah appeared midway through the process, silently taking up a position on the opposite side of the roof. Together, they secured the metal panels, working methodically from the bottom up. When rain threatened before they could finish, Sarah improvised with her collection of tarps, fastening them where the metal sheets ended. The patchwork covering wasn't pretty, but it would keep the interior dry until they could complete the job. That night, the rain tested their work. Sarah lay in her tent, now pitched inside the nearly enclosed structure, listening intently for drips. A few found their way in, but the majority of the space remained dry. It was her first night free from the constant gnawing anxiety of exposure. The next morning she stood in the doorway, watching the sunlight glint off the sections of metal roofing. The structure before her was no longer just a frame. It had become a genuine shelter. The roof, with its mismatched materials and imperfect seams, represented her greatest achievement yet. Her baby kicked vigorously, as if sensing her satisfaction. Yes, I know, she murmured, her hand resting on her belly. We have a roof over our heads. The upper tarp sections fluttered slightly in the breeze, a bright blue against the weathered metal, a visible reminder of adaptability. What she couldn't achieve in perfection, she had achieved in practice. The temporary solutions were not failures, but stepping stones. One day, she promised herself, the entire roof would be properly finished. But for now, it would keep them dry through the coming winter, and that was enough. The county clinic's waiting room was worn but clean, with posters about prenatal vitamins and childhood immunizations decorating the walls. Sarah shifted uncomfortably in the plastic chair, her lower back aching from a morning spent installing door trim. At nearly 30 weeks pregnant, every physical task had become more challenging. Sarah Matthews. A nurse appeared in the doorway, a clipboard in hand. In the exam room, Sarah answered the usual questions about fetal movement, sleep quality, and eating habits. The nurse, Rita, according to her name tag, took notes with a neutral expression that slowly tightened into concern. "Still camping out while you build?" she asked, wrapping the blood pressure cuff around Sarah's arm. "The structure is enclosed now. I've moved my tent inside." Rita pumped the cuff, listening through her stethoscope. "Your pressure is elevated again," she noted, removing the cuff. "And you've gained less weight than we'd like to see at this stage." Dr. Patel came in shortly after, reviewing Sarah's chart with a frown. His examination was thorough, his expression growing more serious as he measured her fundal height. "The baby is measuring a bit small," he explained. "Not dangerously so, but combined with your blood pressure and minimal weight gain, I'm concerned about your living conditions." Sarah tensed. "I have shelter, food, and clean water. Building a house is strenuous work, especially in the third trimester. You need more rest, more calories, and less physical exertion." He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I'm also worried about your birth plan. You live quite a ways out, yes? With limited transportation options." "I'm making arrangements," Sarah said, though in truth, she had been avoiding that particular worry. Dr. Patel wrote a prescription for prenatal vitamins, then looked at her seriously. "Sarah, I need to be direct. If your next appointment shows these trends continuing, I may have to consult with social services about the well-being of you and your baby." A cold fear seized her. "Are you saying they could take my baby?" "I'm saying we need to ensure you both have adequate support for a healthy delivery and postnatal period." His tone softened. "This isn't a threat, but a medical concern. Please consider accepting more help." In the hallway after the appointment, Rita touched Sarah's arm lightly. "Here," she said, pressing a pamphlet into Sarah's hand. "The free clinic has a prenatal support program. They can help with transport to appointments, nutritional assistance, even temporary housing if it's needed." Sarah stared at the colorful brochure, her emotions raw. Everything she had done, every nail hammered, every board salvaged, had been to create independence, to build a home where no one could ever abandon her or her child again. The idea that this very effort could result in losing her baby was unthinkable. "I'm not looking for a handout," she said stiffly. "It's not charity, it's community," Rita corrected gently. "Nobody does it all alone, especially not raising a child." Driving back to her homestead, Sarah studied the pamphlet. Despite her pride, it offered practical support without stripping away her autonomy. Transportation vouchers, nutrition education, and even doula services for the birth, all designed to strengthen families, not separate them. The reality of her situation pressed in with a new urgency. Her cabin, though enclosed, still lacked proper insulation, reliable heat, and basic amenities. Her diet consisted mostly of cheap staples, rice, beans, oats, supplemented by occasional gifts of canned goods or garden vegetables from anonymous community members. And her due date was looming, just 10 weeks away. That night, sitting on her newly laid plywood floor, Sarah made a list of the tasks essential for creating a minimally acceptable living situation. Wood stove installation, basic plumbing, electricity, and a proper bed. The list was daunting, especially given her diminishing physical capabilities. A knock on her makeshift door, a salvaged hollow core slab hung on temporary hinges, startled her. No one ever knocked. Elijah simply appeared on the property when needed. Sarah opened the door to find Rita, the nurse from the clinic, holding a canvas tote bag. "I hope you don't mind," Rita said, her professional gaze taking in the cabin's interior. "I thought I'd drop this by on my way home." She handed Sarah the bag, which contained prenatal vitamins, iron supplements, and several protein-rich meal replacement packets. "The clinic just filled your prescription after you left," Rita explained, though they both knew this visit was beyond professional obligation. Sarah hesitated, then stepped back. "Do you want to come in? It's not much yet." But Rita did step inside, her eyes scanning the progress. Windows installed, partial insulation up, the tent still serving as a bedroom in one corner. "You've done remarkable work," she said sincerely. "But you're racing 2 clocks now, winter and the baby." "I'm aware," Sarah replied, one hand unconsciously resting on her rounded belly. "The program I mentioned," Rita began. "I'll think about it," Sarah cut in. "But this is our home. I'm not giving up on it." Rita nodded with understanding. "No one is asking you to. But accepting help to make it safer isn't failure, Sarah." She glanced at the disassembled wood stove in the corner. "Is that your heating solution?" "Once I can get it vented properly, yes. My husband's a contractor. He could help install that safely. It's critical for carbon monoxide prevention with a newborn." The offer hung in the air between them. Sarah's instinct to refuse warred with Dr. Patel's warnings and the reality of her shrinking timeline. "I could pay something," she said finally. Rita smiled. "Start by taking better care of yourself. Eat these protein bars, take your vitamins, and get more rest. That's payment enough." After Rita left, Sarah sat on her sleeping bag with the pamphlet and the nutritional supplements beside her. The baby shifted inside her, delivering a sharp kick to her ribs, as if offering an opinion on the matter. "I know," she whispered. "We need help." The admission felt less like a defeat and more like an evolution. The goal had never been isolation, but self-sufficiency within a community. Perhaps accepting targeted help now would enable greater independence later. Carefully, Sarah placed the clinic pamphlet with her building plans. Another resource, another tool to build the home her child deserved. With the exterior weatherproofed, Sarah turned her attention inward. The inside of her small cabin was a blank canvas of rough-framed walls awaiting insulation, a bare subfloor, and exposed ceiling joists. Though modest in size, the space would need distinct areas for sleeping, cooking, and living. Rita's husband, Jim, had indeed come to install the wood stove, bringing his expertise and the proper venting materials. The black cast-iron stove, salvaged from the town dump and painstakingly restored by Sarah, now stood proudly on a hearth of reclaimed brick. Her first fire filled the cabin with a bone-deep warmth she hadn't felt since leaving her apartment months ago. "Baby needs warm air and warm food," Elijah commented on one of his increasingly frequent visits, eyeing the wood stove with approval. Next came insulation, a hodgepodge of solutions based on availability, not convention. Rigid foam boards salvaged from a renovation project covered most of the walls, supplemented with crumpled newspaper packed into the gaps. In the ceiling, Sarah carefully installed fiberglass bats donated by Jim, who'd over-ordered for another project. She recognized the fiction for what it was, kindness disguised as coincidence, and accepted the gift with silent gratitude. The physical limitations of late pregnancy forced adaptations to her work style. Tasks that required overhead reach were tackled first thing in the morning, when her energy was at its peak. She worked in shorter bursts, resting between efforts. Simple tools became extensions of her own body. A broom handle with a nail hammered into the end helped her position the ceiling insulation. A garden kneeler, salvaged from a yard sale, eased the strain of low work. Each night, Sarah would collapse into her tent, still pitched in a corner of the increasingly habitable space, her body aching, but her mind already cataloging the day's progress and planning the next steps. The interior partition evolved naturally. The wood stove occupied one wall, and its heat distribution dictated the location of her sleeping area nearby. A collection of stacked and secured wooden crates became a rudimentary kitchen counter along the opposite wall. Between them, a space to sit and eventually, for her child to play. When Miguel from the construction site showed up unexpectedly one Saturday with leftover vinyl flooring, Sarah felt an unexpected surge of emotion. The gray, faux wood pattern wasn't what she would have chosen, but as he laid it over her plywood subfloor, it instantly transformed the space from a work site into a home. "Just scraps from the job at the bank," Miguel insisted, helping her measure and cut the pieces to fit around the wood stove. Would have gone in the trash anyway. That night, Sarah dismantled her tent for the last time. Using the rainfly as a temporary curtain for the windows, she repurposed the tent's ground sheet as a mattress pad. Her sleeping bag, stretched out on the newly installed floor, became her first proper bed in her new home. The ceiling remained her greatest challenge. The exposed rafters and metal roof offered poor insulation and constant noise when it rained. Sarah's solution came from the pile of flattened cardboard boxes she had been collecting. Nailed carefully to the underside of the rafters and painted with leftover white paint, they created a crude but effective ceiling that brightened the space considerably. A particularly meaningful project emerged on a rainy afternoon, when physical fatigue forced a break from more practical chores. Using salvaged pine boards too small for structural purposes, Sarah began building a crib. Each piece was sanded by hand. The corners were carefully rounded. The design was simple but sturdy. As her belly grew, her movements slowed, but her sense of purpose only sharpened. "This is for you," she would tell her unborn child as she worked, fitting the pieces together with glue and dowels instead of nails for safety. "Your first real piece of furniture." The crib took shape over several days, becoming both a practical necessity and a symbolic milestone. Sarah positioned it along the wall near where she slept, its presence transforming the space into a nursery and into a home. Light fixtures were beyond her current means, so Sarah created alternatives. Glass jars fitted with solar-powered LED lights were placed strategically on shelves and counters. The soft glow they provided felt almost magical at night, casting gentle shadows across the hand-built walls. On one particularly productive day, Sarah stood in the center of her nearly finished interior, turning slowly to take it all in. Insulated walls, now covered with salvaged paneling and mismatched beadboard. The wood stove radiating a steady warmth. Her sleeping area, defined by a second-hand rug, and the repurposed tent floor. The kitchen corner, with its crate cupboards and a two-burner camp stove, and the crib, waiting patiently for its occupant. Nothing matched. Nothing was perfect. The materials were second-hand, the finish sometimes crude. But standing there, hands on the small of her back to ease the ache of her 8th month, Sarah felt something profound. The space had a coherence that went beyond its components. It had become more than a shelter. It had become a home. That evening, as she warmed a simple stew on the wood stove, a knock came at her door. Still temporary, but now functional, with a proper lock installed. It was Rita, a small package in her hands. "Housewarming gift," she explained, stepping inside and taking in the transformation with clear surprise. "Sarah, this is wonderful." The gift was a handmade quilt, not new, but carefully mended, the perfect size for a crib. "It was my daughter's," Rita explained. "I thought your little one might like it too." Sarah draped the colorful quilt over the crib, and its cheerful pattern brought the simple pine construction to life. Something inside her shifted and settled, as if the baby had found a more comfortable position. "It's perfect," she said softly, running her fingers over the stitches that connected one generation to the next. "Thank you." The first frost arrived overnight, painting delicate white patterns on the windows and hardening the ground underfoot as Sarah ventured out to collect water from her rain barrel. Inside, the wood stove kept her cabin surprisingly cozy, but the morning chill served as a stark reminder. Winter was approaching fast, and her preparations were still incomplete. At 32 weeks pregnant, her movements had grown considerably slower. The baby had settled low in her pelvis, a constant presence that affected her balance and stamina. Simple tasks now required deliberate planning. Complex ones required help, something she was still learning to accept. Sarah consulted the list taped to the wall beside her makeshift kitchen area. Weatherproof the door, gather firewood, install shelves, create food storage, finish the water system. The list seemed to grow rather than shrink, despite her constant efforts. The door was her most pressing concern. The temporary solution, a hollow-core interior door salvaged from a remodel, offered privacy but little insulation against the deepening cold. Sarah had researched how to build a proper, insulated exterior door, but the materials and tools required were beyond her current resources. As she mulled over this problem during a breakfast of oatmeal, a now familiar knock sounded. "Morning," Elijah said as she opened the door, his breath visible in the cold air. "Brought you something." Behind him, his old pickup truck sat with an exterior door in the bed. It was solid wood with a small glass pane, weathered but sturdy. "Neighbor replaced his," he explained with his typical brevity. "Figured you could use it." Together, they removed the temporary door and set the new one, with Elijah quietly showing her how to hang it plumb and seal it properly against drafts. The immediate difference was palpable, a substantial barrier between her growing sanctuary and the increasingly hostile elements. "Thank you," Sarah said, when they were done, the words feeling inadequate for the mix of gratitude and humility she felt. Elijah just nodded and gestured toward the woods beyond the clearing. "We should talk about firewood." They walked together to the edge of her property, where he pointed out dead, standing trees suitable for harvesting. "These first," he instructed. "They're already seasoned. Green wood makes smoke, not heat." The lesson continued as he demonstrated how to identify suitable trees, explained the best cutting techniques for her limited strength, and showed her how to split logs with the maul he'd brought. Stack it against the south wall, he advised. Morning sun will dry any moisture. Keep it covered, but with airflow. By late morning, Sarah had a modest pile of split firewood and a handful of blisters, despite the work gloves Rita had given her. Elijah promised to return with his chainsaw on the weekend to help build up her stock. As October bled into November, the community's involvement in Sarah's project became more overt. The pretense of coincidental help soon faded as the threat of winter loomed larger than concerns over her independence. Marge from the library arrived with books on winter gardening and food preservation, along with a box of canned goods left over from a church food drive. Miguel and two other construction workers spent a Sunday installing proper gutters and downspouts, connecting them to her rain barrels and showing her how to prevent them from freezing. Even the skeptical Mrs. Patterson from the church council appeared, bearing hand-knitted baby blankets and winter maternity clothes she'd found at a rummage sale. "We're not interfering," she stated firmly when Sarah began to protest. "We're being neighbors." The woodpile against Sarah's south wall grew steadily, with contributions appearing mysteriously when she was away at appointments or working inside. Elijah never mentioned these community additions to their joint efforts, but his knowing look told Sarah he was well aware of the collective project her wood supply had become. Inside, Sarah focused on creating the storage and organization that would make the winter months manageable. Shelves built from salvaged lumber lined the walls, holding her modest but growing collection of essentials. Canned food, medical supplies, and baby items gradually accumulated through the clinic's support program. Under the kitchen counter, she installed a simple basin sink with a drain pipe leading outside, allowing for basic washing until she could implement a more sophisticated water system. A large pot kept on the wood stove provided a constant supply of hot water sent for bathing and cleaning. The physical limitations of late pregnancy demanded creative solutions. When she could no longer safely climb to reach high shelves, she reorganized her storage for easy access. When splitting wood became too tiring, she devised a seated method that protected her back. Each adaptation was a conversation with her body and her environment, finding the balance between need and ability, between independence and safety. As the first snowflakes danced outside her windows, Sarah sat by the wood stove, hands resting on her round belly, observing her creation. The cabin was far from perfect. The uneven floors, mismatched materials, and improvised solutions were visible everywhere. But it was solid. It was warm. It was hers. The baby shifted under her hands, a rolling motion that still startled her despite its familiarity. "I know," she murmured. "It's not what I planned either. But we'll be warm and we'll be dry, and that's what matters." Through the window, she could see the woodpile, now covered with a tarp against the weather. It represented more than fuel for the stove. It represented the community she had reluctantly allowed into her life. Each log was a small act of faith, in her project, in her ability, in her future. Winter was coming, but for the first time since Jack had left, Sarah faced the changing season not with fear, but with a quiet resolve. She had built more than a shelter. She had built a place to welcome her child, a place to begin their life together. "We're ready," she said to her baby, as the snow began to fall in earnest, blanketing her clearing in a pristine white. "Or as ready as we'll ever be." Sarah was organizing her scant pantry when she noticed the car parked at the end of her drive. Unlike the usual beat-up trucks and sedans that occasionally appeared, this was a newer model, with the logo of the local paper on the door. A woman approached, notebook in hand, her city clothes marking her as an outsider, almost as clearly as her determined stride. Sarah tensed, one hand moving automatically to her belly in a protective gesture. "Ms. Matthews, I'm Diane Weber from the Pinewood Gazette," the woman said, offering a professional smile. "I was hoping for a few minutes of your time." Sarah's brow furrowed. "I'm not interested in being interviewed." "The community has been talking about your project for months," Diane said, gesturing to the cabin. "A pregnant woman building her own home from salvaged materials. It's a remarkable story." "It's my life, not a story," Sarah replied. But despite her misgivings, she invited the reporter inside. The November chill made standing in the doorway uncomfortable, and her back had been aching persistently since morning. Inside, Diane's eyes widened as she took in the small but functional space. The wood stove radiating heat, the handmade furniture, the carefully organized storage solutions. "You did all this yourself?" The professional detachment in her voice gave way to genuine awe. "With some help," Sarah acknowledged, thinking of Elijah's quiet guidance and the community's growing support. The questions came quickly after that. How had she learned construction? Where had she found the materials? What drove her to take on such a project while pregnant? How did she manage the physical challenges? Sarah answered carefully, emphasizing the practical aspects rather than the personal circumstances that had led her here. She spoke of her grandmother's legacy, of her research in the library, of the unexpected kindness of neighbors, but she kept the raw wounds of Jack's abandonment and her crushing financial despair locked away. "May I take a few photos?" Diane asked as their conversation wound down. Sarah hesitated, the spotlight feeling alien, but a flicker of opportunity sparked within her. "On one condition, mention that most of the materials were salvaged or donated. I want people to see the possibility in what gets thrown away." 2 days later, the article appeared on the front page of the local weekly. "Mountain Mother-to-be builds her world from the ground up." The accompanying photograph captured her standing proudly beside the small cabin, one hand resting on the swell of her belly. Her expression, a mixture of gravity and grit. The story emphasized her resourcefulness and the slow-building community support for her project. The effect was immediate and seismic. Sarah's private endeavor was thrust into the public eye overnight. People she'd never met greeted her in town. Cars slowed as they passed her property, their occupants craning their necks for a glimpse of the now famous cabin in the woods. While the attention chafed, it brought a surprising tide of support. The owner of the local hardware store offered her store credit in exchange for consulting on an upcycling workshop. The very construction firm that had once dismissed her called to offer surplus materials from their completed projects. Even the skeptical welfare officer, who had initially questioned her fitness, stopped by to commend her progress. But the most significant development arrived via the library's computer, an email from a small environmental nonprofit. They wanted to document her use of reclaimed materials as part of their sustainable housing initiative. They offered a modest stipend for her participation and consultation. "This isn't charity," Marge had insisted when Sarah hesitated. "It's a recognition of your expertise. You've created something of value here. Not just a structure, but knowledge." Sarah stared at the email, a storm of conflicting emotions churning within her. She had embarked on this project to forge an independence so fierce it could never be taken from her. Now, paradoxically, that very effort was weaving her more deeply into the fabric of the world. The stipend would provide a critical financial buffer as her due date loomed. Budgeted carefully, it would cover the solar panel kit she'd been researching and basic supplies for the baby's first few months. Yet, accepting it meant fully embracing the new public identity the newspaper had created, the mountain mother-to-be. That night, as she carefully fed the wood stove, Sarah considered how her definition of self-sufficiency had been reshaped. True independence, she was learning, wasn't a fortress built against the world. It was about building a life where support was reciprocal, not one-sided, where vulnerability could coexist with strength. The baby kicked, a powerful, insistent thump, as if to punctuate the thought. "I know," she murmured. "We're not alone anymore. And maybe that's for the best." The next day, she typed her acceptance email at the library, formally agreeing to share her story and knowledge with the nonprofit. As she typed, a realization settled over her. She was no longer just building a shelter. She was contributing to a larger conversation about ingenuity, community, and creative problem-solving. On her way home, Sarah stopped at the post office to check her rarely used P.O. box. Tucked between flyers and junk mail was a letter forwarded from her old address, an official-looking envelope from a record label. Inside was a royalty check for Jack's band, pitifully small, but bearing his name. Sarah stared at it, a strange sense of calm washing over her. The check represented everything she had left behind: the uncertainty, the dependency, the waiting for someone else to dictate her future. She slipped it into her pocket, planning to forward it to his last known address. Unlike months ago, the sight of his name no longer triggered a pang of pain or longing, only the distant acknowledgement of a path not taken. Back at her cabin, a delivery awaited her. Precisely cut lumber for shelves, with a note from Rita's husband, Jim. "Figured you could use these for the baby's things." The thoughtfulness, not just the materials, but the quiet attention to her specific needs, brought unexpected tears to her eyes. That night, working by lamplight, Sarah installed the shelves near the bassinet, creating a changing station and a place for the baby items that were slowly accumulating from the clinic's support program and community gifts. The newspaper article, folded neatly and tucked among her building plans, had become a landmark, marking the transition from isolation to integration. The cabin was still her creation, her triumph, but its story now belonged, in part, to the community that had slowly, surely, embraced both it and her. At 36 weeks pregnant, Sarah's world had shrunk to the rhythm of her own body, measured in the tightening and releasing of increasingly persistent Braxton Hicks contractions. The clinic had assured her they were just practice, but their frequency served as a constant, thrumming reminder of her approaching due date and the preparations still to be made. "Birth plan," Rita stressed during Sarah's weekly checkup, handing her a printed form. "You need to start thinking about your options, your preferences." Sarah glanced at the document, the weight of its implications settling upon her. Hospital or birthing center? Pain management preferences? Who would be with her? Transportation plan? Each question underscored a reality she had been too busy building to fully contemplate. Soon she would be bringing a new life into the world. "I haven't thought much beyond getting a roof over our heads," she admitted, her voice quiet. Rita's expression softened. "That's why we're doing this now. Let's start with the practicals. How will you get to the hospital when you go into labor?" That, at least, had a straightforward answer. The clinic's prenatal support program had connected Sarah with a network of volunteer drivers for appointments. One call would bring transport within 30 minutes, assuming she had phone service. "I've been looking into it," Sarah explained. The prepaid cell has spotty reception on my property, but it works fine on the main road. I've timed the walk, 12 minutes at my current pace. Rita nodded, impressed, but a frown creased her brow at the mention of the walk. And what if labor comes on fast, or the weather's bad? The question hung in the air, highlighting the gaps in Sarah's meticulous planning. Her fierce independence had served her well in building a shelter, but childbirth would require a different kind of foresight. Contingencies for scenarios beyond her control. That evening, Sarah spread the birth plan across her small table, methodically filling it in. Hospital, open to pain management if needed. No specific birth preferences beyond basic dignity and informed consent. Main contact. Rita, who had offered to be her support person if labor began outside of clinic hours. As she wrote, the reality of her situation deepened. Her baby would be born into this small cabin, not physically born in it, but into the wider reality of the life they would share here. Every decision she made now would shape that life. The following days were a blur of focused activity, a final push of preparation. Sarah installed a simple rainwater catchment system, one she could access from inside during the winter. She organized the trove of baby supplies that had come through the clinic's program and community gifts. Diapers, wipes, tiny clothes sorted by size, a second-hand bassinet that had been delivered anonymously after the newspaper article ran. Transportation remained her greatest anxiety. The volunteer driver network was reliable, but not immediate, and mountain winters could render the road impassable without warning. Sarah needed a backup plan. The solution came from Elijah during one of his increasingly frequent visits, bringing a load of split firewood to add to her considerable stack. "You got a CB radio?" he asked offhandedly. "It's old, but it works. I can show you the emergency channel." The radio appeared the next day, a bulky, functional relic by modern standards, with a handwritten guide to the channels taped to its back. Elijah spent an hour showing Sarah how to operate it, explaining which frequencies were monitored by emergency services and which were monitored by locals like himself. "There's always someone listening," he assured her. Day and night, the unit held a place of honor near her bed, its presence a strange and profound comfort. A lifeline that didn't require a walk to the main road, a cell signal, or the cooperation of the weather. Water became her next focus. The rain barrel system worked for cleaning and bathing, but Sarah needed reliable drinking water. Jim, Rita's husband, arrived one Saturday with a filtration unit salvaged from a cabin renovation. "This will screen out sediment and most contaminants," he explained as he installed it on her main barrel. "Still best to boil it for drinking, but it's safer for everything else." As her due date neared, Sarah found herself repeatedly drawn to the small corner she had prepared for her child. The handmade bassinet with the donated quilt, the changing area with its neatly folded diapers, the cradle positioned close to her own bed for late-night feedings. These physical preparations grounded her whenever the anxiety of the impending birth threatened to overwhelm her. Dr. Patel noted her progress with an approving nod during her 38-week appointment. "Blood pressure has stabilized, weight gain is better, and the baby's growth has improved," he observed. "Your living situation has clearly become more tenable." "I've had help," Sarah acknowledged, the admission coming more easily now. "That's evident in your birth plan, too," he remarked. "Good contingencies, realistic expectations. You've done your homework." The doctor's confidence bolstered her own. She had researched childbirth as methodically as she had studied construction techniques, preparing herself mentally as well as practically, attending the clinic's birthing classes faithfully despite the transportation challenges. One suggestion, Dr. Patel added. Pack 2 separate bags, one for a planned hospital arrival and one for an emergency go bag. Keep the go bag near the door with just the essentials. Sarah acted on the advice the moment she got home, organizing supplies into clearly marked bags. The process felt like construction in miniature, assembling the necessary components, creating structure from potential chaos, preparing for multiple scenarios. A light December snow was falling as she worked, the first significant accumulation of the season, visible through her window. She could see the white blanket transforming her property, softening the hard edges of her construction site. The wood smoke from her stove rose in a straight column against the gray sky, a visible sign of the warmth and shelter she had created. Inside, the cabin had evolved from a mere construction project into a genuine home. Curtains made from salvaged fabric softened the windows. A bookshelf held pregnancy and baby care guides alongside her dog-eared construction manuals. The wood stove threw out a steady, bone-deep warmth that permeated the well-insulated walls, creating a cocoon of comfort against the winter chill. As night fell, Sarah sat in the rocking chair, another community gift, completing the final item on her birth prep checklist, a letter to her unborn child. In it, she documented the journey that had brought them to this moment, the challenges overcome, the home built board by board with determination, and eventually, with the help of a community. "You were my reason," she wrote, her pen moving steadily across the page. "The reason I found a strength I never knew I possessed. This house is your birthright. Not just the physical structure, but the knowledge that we can build what we need, even when it seems impossible." Outside, the snow continued to fall, each flake a temporary visitor that would eventually give way to spring. Inside, Sarah rocked gently, her hands cradling her full belly. She was no longer waiting alone. The storm warnings began on a Tuesday, crackling over the CB radio that had become Sarah's constant companion. Winter had settled firmly in the mountains, but this system promised to be exceptional. Heavy snow, freezing temperatures, high winds, the kind of weather that could isolate rural communities for days. Sarah listened intently, mentally cataloging her provisions. Firewood stacked high beside the stove, enough for at least 2 weeks. A pantry organized and full, thanks to her careful budgeting of the nonprofit grant. Water barrels topped off from a recent rain, protected against freezing by insulated covers Jim had helped her install. At 39 weeks pregnant, her due date was just 7 days away. The timing of the storm stirred a deep, primal anxiety that no amount of preparation could fully quell. "You'll be fine," Rita had assured her during a phone call from the clinic. "First babies are usually late, but keep that CB radio charged, just in case." When the first flakes began to drift down on Wednesday morning, Sarah completed her storm preparations. She filled every available container with filtered water. She set her emergency supplies near the door: flashlights, extra blankets, the hospital bags. She stacked extra firewood inside the cabin, making the small space more difficult to navigate, but ensuring her fuel was accessible and dry. By afternoon, the snow fell in thick curtains, the wind driving it horizontally against the windows. The temperature dropped rapidly as darkness crept in and the storm intensified, just as predicted. Sarah lit the fireplace and settled in, trying to quell the worry that churned like the wind outside her walls. The cabin groaned and creaked under the storm's assault, but it held firm. No leaks appeared in the roof she had so carefully built. No drafts penetrated the insulation she had painstakingly installed. The wood stove maintained a steady, radiating warmth, a testament to the well-designed flue and chimney. Pride in these accomplishments offered some comfort as she listened to the wind howl. This structure, built from salvaged materials and sheer determination, was protecting her exactly as she had intended. The power grid failed around midnight, plunging the surrounding area into blackness. Sarah only noticed because the few distant lights visible from her windows vanished. Inside, her solar-charged lanterns and the heat from the wood stove continued uninterrupted, her off-grid systems proving their worth. She slept poorly, waking often to add wood to the stove and listen to the storm. Each time she rose, she noted the deepening snow, now visible through the windows, illuminated by the strange, reflected light of the white landscape. Dawn brought no relief. If anything, the storm had intensified. The snow now drifted halfway up the windows on the leeward side of the cabin. The CB radio crackled with reports of road closures across the county, emergency services operating on a skeleton crew, and power outages affecting thousands. Sarah kept to her routine despite the chaos outside, feeding the fire, preparing simple meals, and reviewing her birthing supplies. The forced stillness gave her time to focus on the movements of her child, now settled low in her pelvis, seemingly as ready as she was for their shared journey to move into its next phase. The first contraction came in the mid-afternoon, a tightening in her lower back she initially dismissed as just another persistent ache of late pregnancy. When it returned 20 minutes later, a little stronger, she began to time them. They were still irregular, still mild, but unmistakably different from the Braxton Hicks contractions she had been feeling for weeks. Not yet, she told herself firmly. Not in this storm. By evening, the contractions had settled into a pattern. Every 15 minutes, lasting 30 seconds, gradually building in intensity. It was still early labor, according to her research, but it was progressing steadily. Sarah forced herself to eat despite a dwindling appetite, knowing she would need her strength for what was to come. She keyed the mic on the CB radio, following the protocol Elijah had taught her. "This is Sarah Matthews at the Matthews Homestead, Pine Ridge Road, requesting assistance. Early labor in a blizzard. Over." The reply came quickly. The calm voice of a dispatcher asked for details of her condition. Sarah provided the information methodically. Contraction interval, membranes intact, no bleeding, baby moving normally. The dispatcher promised to alert the volunteer emergency response team and to stay in touch. An hour passed with no further updates, the contractions continuing their inexorable march. They were 10 minutes apart now, each one requiring focused breathing to manage. Sarah paced her small cabin between them, stopping to lean against the walls or furniture when the tightening demanded her full attention. The radio crackled to life again. "Matthews Homestead, this is dispatch. Roads to your location are currently impassable for standard vehicles. Snow removal equipment is prioritizing main arteries. Emergency response has been notified of your situation. Please update us on any changes. Over." The clinical tone did little to mask the essential message. She was on her own. At least for now. Sarah acknowledged the transmission calmly. Then she allowed herself a single moment of pure fear before her pragmatic nature reasserted control. She had prepared for this possibility. The emergency birthing kit from the clinic was organized and accessible. She had studied the basics of unassisted childbirth, though she had never imagined she would need to apply the knowledge. She had clean towels, sterilized supplies, and a clear understanding of when complications would require intervention. Another contraction seized her, stronger than before. As it peaked, a sharp crack from outside pierced the steady roar of the storm. Through the window, Sarah saw a massive pine limb crash to the ground, sheared off by ice and wind. A wash of relief passed over her. It had missed her cabin and her woodpile by mere feet. The near miss crystallized her situation. The storm posed dangers beyond her concerns about the birth. She needed help, not just for the delivery, but for basic safety. Her carefully built home provided shelter, but the situation demanded community. The CB radio was her only link to it. She keyed the mic again. Dispatch, this is Sarah Matthews. Labor is progressing. Contractions every 8 minutes. Tree limbs are coming down near the property. Requesting any possible assistance. Over. The response was immediate, but it didn't come from dispatch. A familiar, gruff voice broke through the static. Sarah, it's Elijah. I'm about a half-mile out with emergency gear. You hang tight. Over. The hour following Elijah's radio message felt like an eternity. Sarah moved through contractions that were now 6 minutes apart and demanding all of her focus. She laid out towels and emergency supplies near the bed, mentally reviewing the childbirth information she had so diligently studied. The sound of an engine fighting its way through deep snow finally broke through the howl of the storm. Through the frosted window, Sarah saw headlights, not approaching from the road, but cutting directly through the woods, illuminating the swirling snow between the trees. Minutes later, a heavy knock at the door preceded Elijah's entry. Snow coated his heavy jacket and boots, and his weathered face was flush from the cold and effort. Behind him came a woman Sarah didn't recognize, carrying a large medical kit. Nancy Wilcox, the woman introduced herself briskly, shedding her outerwear. Retired midwife. Your neighbor here called me when he heard about your situation. She nodded at Elijah, who was already stoking the wood stove to raise the heat in the cabin. Sarah felt a wave of relief so intense it momentarily eclipsed the pain of the contractions. Thank you for coming, she managed to say. Nancy's experienced eyes took in Sarah's condition and the cabin's setup. You've prepared well, she observed with approval. How far apart are they now? About 6 minutes. Getting stronger. The retired midwife nodded. Still early. First babies usually take their time. She opened her kit and took out basic monitoring equipment. Let's see how you're progressing. After a thorough examination, Nancy confirmed what Sarah already felt. Labor was advancing normally, but it would still be hours. The baby's heartbeat was strong, its position was good, and Sarah's vitals were stable, despite the stress of the situation. In ideal circumstances, we'd transport you to the hospital, Nancy explained. But with the roads the way they are, she glanced at Elijah, who shook his head grimly. We got here on the old logging trails with the snow machine, he explained. The main roads are impossible. County says maybe noon tomorrow before the plows get this far out. Nancy turned back to Sarah. I've delivered hundreds of babies. If you're comfortable with me assisting you here, I believe we can have a safe, normal delivery. But you should know your options. Sarah considered this as another contraction built and crested. The storm had made the decision for her. Transport to the hospital was impossible right now. Yet the arrival of Elijah and Nancy had transformed her isolated emergency into an attended birth with experienced hands. I trust you, she said simply, once the contraction had passed. The hours that followed settled into a rhythm dictated by Sarah's labor. Nancy provided guidance and monitoring, her calm competence a stabilizing influence. Elijah kept the fire going and cleared a path to the outhouse, maintaining a respectful distance but remaining available if needed. As midnight approached, the storm finally began to wane, the howl of the wind quieting to occasional gusts. Sarah's labor, however, intensified, with contractions now coming every 3 minutes, and demanding her entire being. "You're doing beautifully," Nancy encouraged. "This is transition. It's the hardest part, but it means you're getting close." The next few hours blurred in Sarah's memory, a pain unlike anything she had ever known, interspersed with moments of fierce clarity and determination. Nancy's steady voice guided her. The cozy security of the cabin enveloped them, the strange intimacy of bringing a life into the world in the very house she had built with her own hands. At 3:42 in the morning, with one last, tremendous effort, Sarah's daughter came into the world, red-faced, indignant, and perfectly formed. Nancy placed the child on Sarah's chest, where tiny fingers unfurled and a wavering cry announced her arrival. "Hello," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I'm your mother. We made it." Nancy efficiently managed the third stage of labor, ensuring the placenta was delivered completely and checking Sarah for complications. Finding none, she helped clean and swaddle the newborn, then guided Sarah through the first feeding, the baby latching on with a strength that was surprising for one so new to the world. Outside, the storm had finally broken. Moonlight streamed through the windows, reflecting off the snow-covered landscape and filling the cabin with an ethereal glow. Elijah appeared briefly at the bedroom doorway. "Radios are working again. I called the clinic. They know you're okay." His eyes met Sarah's, a rare smile softening his features. "You've got a beautiful daughter." By dawn, the situation had stabilized. Sarah rested in bed, her daughter sleeping beside her in the handmade bassinet, temporarily moved bedside. Nancy had cleaned the birthing area and was preparing a light breakfast in the compact kitchen. Through the windows, the rising sun turned the snow-covered world into a breathtaking panorama of white and gold. The CB radio chattered with updates on the progress of road clearing. Emergency services expected to reach their area by noon, with medical transport possible soon after. The county clinic had been notified of the birth and was preparing for their arrival as soon as travel was feasible. Sarah dozed intermittently, waking to check on her daughter with a sense of awe that had not diminished. This child, conceived in one life and born into another entirely, represented everything she had fought for over the past months. Nancy approached with a cup of herbal tea. "You should try to rest while she sleeps. You'll need your strength." Sarah accepted the tea gratefully. "I still can't believe she's here, that we're both okay." "You were prepared," Nancy answered simply. "The cabin, the supplies, the knowledge, you created everything she needed for a safe arrival." Later that morning, the distant rumble of snowplows announced the gradual restoration of a connection to the outside world. By early afternoon, a county medical transport arrived, Rita accompanying the paramedics after insisting on joining them, despite being off duty. "Oh, Sarah," Rita breathed, seeing the newborn. "She's beautiful. Are you both all right?" The examination confirmed what Nancy had already determined. Mother and baby were fine, despite the unplanned home birth. Transport to the hospital was still recommended for a full checkup. As the paramedics prepared for the transport, Sarah looked around the small cabin, the space that had sheltered them through the storm and the birth, the home she had created from cast-off materials and pure will. "I need to gather a few things," she said to Rita, who helped her pack the essentials for a hospital stay. At the door, Sarah paused. Something about leaving, even temporarily, triggered an unexpected wave of emotion. This place had witnessed her transformation from abandoned and desperate to capable and strong. Its walls had absorbed her fears, and now held the echo of her daughter's first cries. "We'll be back soon," she whispered to the empty room, a promise to the house and to herself. Outside, Elijah watched as the paramedics carefully helped Sarah and her blanket-wrapped baby into the transport vehicle. Their eyes met briefly in a moment of unspoken understanding, an acknowledgement of a journey completed and another just beginning. "What's her name?" he asked quietly. It was the most personal question he had ever asked. Sarah looked down at her daughter's face, peaceful in her sleep. James had seen it before, that quiet competence in his son. He'd seen it when Elijah nursed a wounded hawk back to health the previous spring, and again when he'd figured out how to modify their neighbor's tractor after the man lost his fingers in an accident. "It's a good thought, son," James said gently. "But rebuilding takes money. Materials, labor. The Greens don't have insurance that covers this kind of damage." "I know," Elijah said, taking his sketchbook back. "I was just thinking." After his father left, Elijah reopened the notebook and worked on his drawings until well past midnight. In the corner of his room, an old coffee can labeled Building Fund held his life savings, $21,743, earned from odd jobs, birthday money, and the sale of hand-carved fishing lures he made during the winter months. It wasn't nearly enough, and he knew it. But somewhere between the math and the impossibility lived the stubbornness that defined the mountain people. And in that space, Elijah Murphy was forming a plan. The dawn broke cool and clear as Martha and Harold prepared to leave. The Johnsons' truck would be there soon, marking the end of 60 years on their mountain homestead. "Did you pack your medicine?" Martha asked, methodically running through her mental checklist. Harold nodded, distracted. He was kneeling before a small metal footlocker he had pulled from beneath a fallen rafter. The latch was rusted shut and fought him. When it finally gave way, he paused before lifting the lid, as if opening a time capsule. Inside lay his military effects: discharge papers, medals in tarnished cases, a folded American flag, and resting on top, his veteran's cap. The simple blue cap with gold embroidery had been with him to every Memorial Day service, 4th of July parade, and veteran's funeral since he'd come home. Harold lifted it gently, dusting off the insignia. Faded stitching proclaimed Korean War Veteran, 7th Infantry Division. "I thought this was lost," he murmured, turning it over in his hands. Martha stopped her packing. "You should wear it today. Might help the Johnsons see there's still some dignity left in these old bones." Harold set it on his head, the familiar weight offering a strange comfort amidst the chaos. In the reflection of a broken window pane, he barely recognized himself. The proud soldier was now an old man, displaced by forces beyond his control. "Feels like a retreat," he said softly. Martha came to his side, placing a hand on his shoulder. "It's not a surrender, Harold. It's a strategic repositioning." Her attempt at military terminology brought a faint smile to his lips. The hours passed in a blur of final decisions, sorting the few belongings they would take from what would be left behind for a later, uncertain recovery. The choices were agonizing. Every item was a memory. A rocking chair he'd built when they were expecting their first child. Martha's mother's china, miraculously intact in its cabinet. Waterlogged books, now beyond saving. And the tools from Harold's workshop, too heavy and numerous to move. By noon, their life had been reduced to 3 suitcases and 5 cardboard boxes. "We're here!" Frank Johnson's voice called from outside, followed by the slam of a truck door. While Martha went to greet the neighbors who had become their saviors, Harold took one last walk through the ruins of their bedroom. He stopped at the dresser, where Martha's jewelry box sat untouched. The delicate ballerina inside was still poised in a perpetual arabesque. He slipped it into his pocket, a small surprise for later. "You ready, Harold?" Frank asked, already hoisting a box. "Just a minute," Harold replied, his voice thick. He stood in what remained of the doorway, burning the view into his memory, the one he had woken up to for most of his life. The sloping meadow leading to the pine forest, the distant peak etched against the blue sky. The drive to the Johnsons' was mostly silent. Harold stared out the passenger window, watching his mountain recede into the distance. The cap now rested in his lap, his fingers absently tracing the embroidery. "You two get settled," Louise Johnson bustled as they arrived, showing them to a small but comfortable guest room. "I've put fresh towels in the bathroom, and dinner's at 6. Alone, Martha began to unpack while Harold sat heavily on the edge of the bed. "It's temporary," Martha reminded him, hanging dresses in the closet. "Just until we decide about Robert's offer." Harold nodded, but they both heard the hollow cliché. At 80 years old, starting over wasn't just difficult. It was nearly impossible. That night, after an awkward dinner filled with polite conversation and pitying glances, Harold stepped onto the Johnsons' back porch. The stars looked different from this angle. The mountain was just a dark shadow against the night sky. He thought of his cap, left on the dresser in their temporary room, and all it represented: youthful strength, purpose, overcoming adversity. Inside, the phone rang. Martha answered, her voice drifting through the screen door. "Yes, Robert? We're fine for now." "No, I don't think so. I know there's a waiting list." "Yes, your father's fine. Just adjusting." Harold tuned out the conversation, focusing on the distant outline of the mountain. Miles away, under a moon that silvered the destruction, a small figure moved carefully through the rubble of the green cabin. The beam of Elijah's flashlight swept methodically over splintered floorboards and collapsed walls. He carried a tape measure, a notebook, and his father's level, pausing every so often to jot down a measurement or test the stability of a remaining joist. Near what had been the front door, a patch of blue among the debris caught his eye. Kneeling, he pulled Harold's veteran's cap from the wreckage, forgotten in the turmoil of their departure. Elijah brushed it off, studying the embroidered insignia with reverence. Carefully, he placed it in his pack, a tangible link to the man whose home he now surveyed with a determination far beyond his years. 3 days into their stay at the Johnsons', Martha had established a routine that gave structure to their displacement. Mornings were for helping Louise with chores, tasks that allowed Martha to feel useful rather than a burden. Afternoons were spent on the porch making calls, to insurance adjusters who offered little hope, and to Robert, whose patience with his parents' reluctance to commit to Arizona was wearing thin. Harold, meanwhile, grew more withdrawn. He spent hours in Frank's workshop, building nothing, just running his hands over tools so similar to the ones he'd lost. Sometimes he would disappear on long walks, returning with muddy boots and a distant expression that worried Martha.